I thought this cabin was only shelter, until I heard something inside that old barrel.
No lease, no savings, no spare key, just a canvas tool roll and $10 she had kept folded behind her grandmother's photograph. And with that $10, she bought a sea glass polisher's cabin on the coast of Bar Harbor, Hancock County, Maine, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1989. The north wall leaned 3 inches toward the water. Half the cedar shingles had lifted in winter storms. Hancock County had condemned the cabin on March 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Inside its rusted tumbling barrel, behind an oak waterproof lining that no one had opened in decades, waited a sealed compartment holding money, old tools, and glass unlike anything Nora had ever seen. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Nora Bell had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She grew up 2 streets inland from Frenchman Bay, in a narrow rented house where salt filmed the windows by February. Her father left when she was 7. After that, Nora learned to keep treasured things small enough for a coat pocket, and to notice which floorboards complained before adults did. Her mother, Elaine, worked the breakfast shift at a motel near Eden Street and came home with red hands from bleach water. She was not unkind. She was tired in a way that made silence easier than choosing sides. Nora learned early that love and protection were not always the same thing. The steadier presence was Ruth Bell, Elaine's mother, who lived in a gray cottage south of town and made jewelry from glass the Atlantic had worried smooth. Every Saturday, Ruth took Nora to the tide line with 2 enamel pails. They searched after storms. Never before, because Ruth said the sea should be allowed to finish what it had started. Back home, they sorted green bottle glass from cobalt, milk glass, amber, and the rare red pieces. Raw shards went into the rubber-lined tumbler with silicon carbide grit and water. Finished pieces dried on flour sack cloth before Ruth wrapped them in sterling wire with round-nosed pliers worn bright at the jaws. Nora learned to listen for the barrel's rhythm. Too sharp meant too little water. Too heavy meant the load was crowded. Ruth used to say, "The ocean does not repair glass. It teaches the broken edge how to stop cutting." Nora did not understand it at 12. She understood the patience of it. Ruth died in October 2017 after a short illness in Bangor. By the time Nora returned from community college, the cottage had been emptied to cover bills. The tumbler, wire, trays of sorted glass, and Ruth's leather tools were gone. Only a photograph remained. Ruth, at 40, standing beside a much larger barrel Nora had never seen. Nora's older brother, Dean, always spoke softly when he wanted something settled. After their mother moved into assisted housing outside Ellsworth, he persuaded Nora to share an apartment in Bangor. He handled the utilities, bank letters, and anything that arrived in an official envelope. Papers appeared where he said to sign them. Questions met the same calm answer: "I have it handled." On January 8, 2023, Nora came home from a cleaning shift and found a red bank notice beneath the door. Her key still worked, but the kitchen table had been cleared except for a ceramic sugar bowl their mother had given them. Dean stood by the window. Elaine sat in the only chair, both hands around a paper cup. "You need to leave before the bank comes." 8 words. Dean slid a folder toward her. The signature on the loan document looked like Nora's until she saw the crooked second stroke in the B. He had forged her name, mortgaged their shared interest, and defaulted. Nora placed the page beside the sugar bowl and looked at her mother. Elaine lifted her eyes once, then lowered them again. Nora packed 1 sweater, 2 shirts, Ruth's photograph, and a canvas tool roll she had bought years after the original disappeared. When she closed the apartment door, the sugar bowl was still on the table. For 6 weeks she moved north and east in small reductions. 2 nights in a Portland shelter cost nothing, but the bus took $18.75. She slept 4 nights in the Bangor station, then 1 in a laundromat vestibule in Brewer, where the dryers warmed the glass after midnight. In Ellsworth, she paid $32 for a room above a motor court because freezing rain had soaked her shoes. Her money fell from $186 to $121, then $74, then $29.40. She ate oatmeal from convenience stores, apples from a church pantry, and once a bowl of chowder a waitress placed before her without adding it to the check. By mid-February, she'd reached Bar Harbor with $14.62 and nowhere legal to sleep. The Jessup Memorial Library was warm. She sat near a radiator reading old local papers, mostly to avoid watching sleet strike the windows. A typed classified notice had been pinned crookedly beside the public computer sign-up sheet. Hancock County Disposal Property. Former Shoreline Craft Cabin. Unsafe structure. $10 quitclaim transfer to qualified adult willing to assume stabilization and taxes. Inquire County Clerk. Nora read it 3 times. Under Shoreline Craft Cabin, someone had written in pencil, "Old glass polishing place." She touched Ruth's photograph through the canvas of her bag. The county office would close at 4:30. She asked the librarian for directions, filled her water bottle, and stepped back into the sleet. By dusk, $10 had become either the last foolish thing Nora could lose or the first honest thing she could own. The next morning, she started walking toward the county clerk's office with Ruth's photograph against her ribs and exactly $10 left for the cabin. By 8 the next morning, Nora was riding east in the back row of a county bus that smelled faintly of wet wool and floor cleaner. She had spent $2.25 of the money not reserved for the deed on a reduced fare from Bar Harbor toward Ellsworth, then walked the remaining miles with her canvas bag pulling against one shoulder. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees before sunset. She slept that night in the corner of an open hay barn off Route 3, tucked behind square bales where the wind could not reach her directly, and woke twice to the sound of mice working somewhere inside the walls. By morning, she was walking again. Ellsworth came into view slowly. The blue awning of Sylvia's Cafe, the narrow windows of Grant's Hardware, a Bell's Market sign faded at one corner, the brick front of Jordan's Pharmacy, and Wardwell's Feed and Grain, with salt bags stacked beside the door. Delivery trucks moved through slush. Someone was shoveling the bank steps with a square steel shovel. Nora found the Hancock County Clerk's office just after 10. Inside, the air smelled of old and radiator heat. Behind the counter sat a woman with iron gray hair, twisted into a knot so precise that no strand escaped. Her nameplate read, Margaret Haynes, Deputy Clerk. Nora placed the classified notice on the counter. Margaret read it, then looked at Nora's boots. You understand there's no municipal water? Yes, ma'am. You understand the septic approval expired in 1996? Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure is condemned for occupancy? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not reimburse 1 cent if it collapses into the bay? Yes, ma'am. Margaret held her gaze another moment. $10. Nora unfolded the bill she had protected inside Ruth's photograph and slid it beneath the glass. The paperwork took 23 minutes. Nora signed where Margaret indicated, initialed 2 disclosures, and watched the clerk press a heavy brass county stamp into a black ink pad. The stamp came down once, hard enough to shake the pen beside it. Margaret gave her the deed and directions written on the back of an obsolete tax notice. Take Route 3 toward Bar Harbor. Past Hull's Cove, turn where the old quarry road breaks south. There's no street sign anymore. You'll see a stone wall, then 2 black walnuts. The cabin is beyond them. Nora folded the paper. Margaret had already turned toward a file cabinet when she stopped. "What did you say your full name was?" "Nora Bell." The clerk pulled the deed back toward herself. "Bell. Yes, ma'am. Any relation to Ruth Bell?" Nora did not answer immediately. "My grandmother." Margaret sat down. The change in her face was small, but complete. "I knew Ruth." Nora's hand tightened around the canvas strap. Margaret looked past her toward the frosted front windows. Not well. She came in once every few years for shoreline permits. Always carried a tin of glass pieces in her coat pocket. She'd put one on the counter while she waited. "What permits?" "For the old polishing cabin." Nora stared at her. Margaret opened a drawer and removed a manila index card. Its top edge softened with age. The last handwritten entry was dated June 17th, 1988. Ruth E. Bell, seasonal craft use. My grandmother owned it? No. The land belonged to a trust by then. Before that, I don't know. Margaret tapped the card once. But she worked there. I remember because my daughter wanted earrings for her graduation. Ruth made them from blue glass. Nora took Ruth's photograph from the bag. The large barrel in the picture stood behind her grandmother. The wall beside it had a narrow window and a row of wooden pegs. Margaret leaned closer. That is the place. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Then Margaret pushed the deed back across the counter. You should keep that dry. She found an old document envelope, slid the deed inside, and sealed it with 2 strips of clear tape. Nora thanked her. Margaret nodded toward the $10 bill beside the stamp. I'm supposed to put this in the county receipt drawer. Nora waited. Instead, the clerk opened the shallow center drawer of her own desk and laid the bill flat inside. I'll reconcile it this afternoon. Outside, the sky had cleared to a hard February blue. Nora followed Route 3 east, then left the pavement where Margaret had said. Snow lay in the ditch bottoms, gray at the edges. After another mile, she passed a small cedar-shingled house where an elderly man in orange suspenders was splitting birch beside a woodshed. A black and white dog came to the road, barked twice, then followed Nora for 50 yards before the man whistled it home. The old quarry road narrowed. Then she saw the walnuts. They stood on either side of a low stone wall, their branches bare and black against the afternoon sky. Beyond them, the ground dropped toward the water. The cabin waited at the edge of the rocks. It was smaller than Nora had imagined, perhaps 24 feet long and 16 wide, built of weathered cedar boards over a rough timber frame. The roof sagged slightly toward the north corner where shingles had peeled away. A short fieldstone chimney rose from the inland wall, capped with rusted sheet metal. The front porch had lost one step. Above the door hung a wooden sign. Bell Shore. Glass work, most of the paint had gone silver. Nora stood still long enough for the wind to press her coat against her knees. Then she climbed the remaining porch step and pushed the door. It resisted at first. Something dragged across the floor inside. When she leaned her shoulder into the wood, the door moved 6 inches, then a foot. Cold air came out carrying cedar, salt, rust, and the dry mineral smell of old stone. The front room held the cast-iron stove, a narrow table, 2 ladder-back chairs, and shelves clouded with dust. Her boot crossed a patch of grit that clicked faintly under the sole. Somewhere inside the wall, wind made a thin whistling note. The back room was the workroom. Nora stopped in the doorway. A long bench ran beneath the window from Ruth's photograph. Rusted pliers still hung from pegs. Wire spools had turned green at their edges. Against the far wall stood the tumbling barrel, nearly 4 feet across, mounted horizontally on an iron frame. She laid one palm on its oak lining. The wood was cold enough to sting. Outside, waves struck the ledges below the cabin with a slow, heavy sound. Spray salted her lips when she went to check the rear door. The old well pump stood 20 yards inland beneath a crust of ice. An outhouse leaned behind a spruce thicket. There was no electricity, no running water, no bed. Still, every object inside belonged exactly where someone had last left it. Nora swept a rectangle of floor beside the stove with a worn broom she found behind the door. She ate half a heel of bread and the last apple from her bag. Before darkness settled completely, she stuffed newspaper into the gaps around one window and laid her coat beneath her head. The floor was harder than the bus station benches. The sea was louder than traffic. At midnight, the cabin gave a long wooden creak from roof to foundation, and Nora opened her eyes. She waited for another sound. None came. Moonlight crossed the workroom door and touched the iron frame of the great barrel. For the first time in 6 weeks, no one could tell her to leave. The ocean takes our broken things and returns them polished and smooth. The first morning, Nora learned that the well pump worked only after 8 slow strokes. The water came up brown at first, then clear enough to catch the pale sky in the tin cup she held beneath the spout. She boiled it for drinking. The outhouse door required a shoulder against the frame before it would close, and a nail driven into the jamb served as a latch. By the third day, she knew which boards in the cabin complained under her weight, and which one beside the stove gave a hollow knock when stepped on after sunset. She also learned that staying required tools. Grant's Hardware occupied a narrow brick storefront on Main Street, its windows crowded with stovepipe elbows, storm lanterns, and galvanized buckets. The owner, Amos Grant, had one white eyebrow that rose higher than the other whenever he doubted a customer's plan. He listened while Nora explained the cabin, then wiped his hands on a red shop rag. "You own the old Bell place?" "Yes. That roof still attached?" "Mostly." The eyebrow rose. Nora put $4.62 on this counter. "I need to make mostly last longer." Amos looked at the coins, then at her coat. He pulled a ruled ledger from beneath the register. "I can open you 30 days. I do not have regular work." "I didn't ask if you did." He wrote Nora Bell at the top of a page. Her first purchases were small: a chimney brush for $8.95, a coil of sash cord for $3.40, 6 pounds of stove coal for $2.10, glazing points for $1.25, and a used claw hammer from a coffee can marked $5. When she protested the account total, Amos pushed an old paperback across the counter. "Home repairs for Maine houses. Free." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of seeing people fix old buildings with new mistakes." She carried that book home beneath her shirt to keep the pages dry. The chimney came first. Nora disconnected the stovepipe, stuffed a folded feed sack across the opening, and climbed onto the roof with the brush tied to 40 feet of fiberglass rod. She worked from above, turning the brush clockwise through each flue section instead of forcing it downward. Dry flakes of creosote rattled into the firebox. The first pass loosened soot. The second brought down 2 black cakes thick as biscuits. At the throat, the brush snagged. She climbed down, opened the cleanout, and worked upward with a shorter rod until the obstruction broke apart. A bird's nest, old enough to have gone gray, fell into the sack with a scatter of twigs and 1 blue thread. It took 5 hours. By then her gloves were black and her shoulders ached. She checked the masonry with a flashlight, reseated the stovepipe with 3 screws at each joint, and laid a small test fire using newspaper, cedar splinters, and 2 pieces of dry birch the neighbor had left beside the stone wall without a note. The flame caught. Smoke lifted cleanly. Nora held one hand above the stove until warmth reached the knuckles. That evening, she boiled potatoes in a dented enamel pot. She found beneath the workbench and mashed them with salt from a paper packet saved from the bus station. She ate sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. The room smelled of hot iron. On the fourth day, she began taking stock of the workroom. Not everything deserved saving. Some things had rusted beyond use. Others seemed to have been waiting only for a hand. There were round-nose pliers with polished handles, a cedar sorting tray divided into 12 shallow compartments, 2 hand-cranked wire gauges, a brass sieve darkened almost black, a balance scale with 1 missing pan, 3 canvas grit sacks marked 80, 220, and 600, and a wooden caliper whose hinge still moved smoothly after a drop of oil. The tumbling barrel occupied the rear corner. Its iron frame was orange with rust, but the barrel itself was oak-banded and lined inside with darker wood. 4 feet across, nearly 3 feet deep, it was far larger than the hobby tumbler Ruth had used in her cottage. Nora cleaned it last. She swept around the legs, removed 2 mouse nests from beneath the frame, and rubbed the metal axle with kerosene. When she pushed against the rim, the barrel turned half a revolution before stopping with a low, wooden thump. She pushed again. Thump. Nora frowned. A normal, empty tumbler should have sounded light and irregular. This one answered from the same place on every rotation. She marked the rim with chalk. Turn, thump, turn, thump. The sound returned exactly when the chalk mark reached the floor. Nora knelt and tapped the inner lining with the wooden handle of her hammer. Most of the oak gave a high, dry note. One section answered lower. She tapped around it, moving 3 inches at a time, until she had traced a rough circle, almost 18 inches wide. Then she tested the weight. Using a length of pipe as a lever beneath the frame, she raised first one end and then the other. The barrel balanced too heavily toward the marked side, even when she rotated the opening upward. Something was inside the wall. Nora ran her fingertips along the lining. At first she saw only age-darkened oak. Then, beneath a layer of grit near the lower stave, her nail caught a seam. She cleaned it with a toothbrush. A circular cedar disc appeared, fitted almost perfectly into the oak and sealed around its edge with a black waterproof compound that had hardened like stone. There was no handle. At the center sat one recessed brass screw. Nora did not touch it that evening. The next morning she carried the home repairs book to the workbench, opened it beneath a stone to keep the pages flat, and examined the disc again in daylight. She used penetrating oil on the screw and waited 20 minutes. It turned. Behind it was a second screw, then another. 6 in all. When the last one came free, the cedar disc remained fixed by the old sealant. Nora warmed the edge with a cloth dipped in hot water, then worked a thin putty knife beneath the seam. The seal released with a quiet crack. Cold air came from the cavity. Inside were packages wrapped in waxed canvas. Nora sat back on her heels. She removed the first bundle with both hands and placed it on the bench. It held Ruth's missing tools. The leather roll was darker than Nora remembered, but the initials REB were still burned into one corner. Inside lay silver wire pliers, a narrow burnisher, 3 mandrels, and the small awl Ruth had once used to tighten loose wraps around drilled glass. Nora touched none of them for nearly a minute. The second package contained raw material, sea glass, sorted into cloth pouches, each marked by color and size. Green, amber, cobalt, milk white. Then came 2 smaller parcels. The first held marbles. Not toy store marbles, but flawless spheres of weathered glass, each surface frosted by years in salt and sand. Deep cobalt blue, ruby red. Several were nearly an inch across. Nora lifted one toward the window and watched light pass through the center like a small, buried flame. The last parcel was a tin box. Its lid had been sealed with wax. Nora broke it carefully. Inside lay envelopes of paper currency, rolls of coins, 1 tarnished military medal, and a folded letter tied with blue thread. She set the letter aside. The money took more than an hour to count because she counted everything twice. There were old silver $50, mercury dimes, buffalo nickels, and several rolls of wheat cents, alongside later bills that had been added over decades. The military medal was a Purple Heart, its ribbon faded, with 1944 engraved on the reverse. When she finished, Nora wrote the number on the back of a hardware receipt, $37,000 exactly. She counted once more. The number did not change. Outside, evening had begun to flatten the water into bands of pewter. Nora put the bills back into their envelopes, returned the coins to the tin, and wrapped Ruth's tools again. She left only the red marble on the bench. The folded letter remained beside it. Her name was not written on the front. There was no name at all. Nora carried the tin to the stove, then changed her mind and returned it to the workbench. She fed 2 pieces of birch into the fire, buttoned her coat, and went through the back door. The tide was falling. She climbed down to a flat ledge above the water and sat with her hands between her knees. Gulls moved across the outer bay. Behind her, through the workroom window, the single red marble caught the stove light. She stayed there until the cold reached through her boots. She did not read the letter that night. The ocean takes our broken things and returns them polished and smooth. Morning came pale through the patched window. Nora lit the stove, boiled water, and carried the letter to the table. The blue thread came loose with one pull. When she unfolded its pages, she recognized the handwriting before she understood why. The capital R leaned forward exactly as it had on Ruth's Christmas cards. The smaller letters were tighter, older, written by someone who had taught her grandmother how to form them. She began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this barrel, then the shop has outlived me, and perhaps that is enough. My name is Margaret Bell Foster. In April 1988, Dr. Stephen Larkin at Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor told me I had pancreatic cancer. He was careful with the words. I appreciated that. By then I had already learned that bad news becomes no kinder when dressed up. This work began with my great-grandfather, Thomas Bell, who came to Hancock County from Gloucester in 1871 and gathered bottle glass after winter tides. His daughter Sarah Bell, born here in 1878, learned to grind sharp edges by hand before tumblers were common. Sarah's daughter, Eleanor Bell Foster, my mother, was born in 1901 and kept the trade through the Depression. I was born Margaret Eleanor Foster in 1926 and learned beside her. My niece Ruth Bell came after me. 4 generations, if anyone is counting. Mostly we were women trying to make honest things from what other people had discarded. The trade closed on September 30th, 1988. There had already been more than 30 years in which fewer people came through that door. Machines made imitation glass quickly. Tourists preferred pieces that looked perfect before they had ever touched salt water. We kept working anyway. My husband, Daniel Foster, died in France in August 1944 while serving with the United States Army. The Purple Heart in this box was his. Do not sell it unless hunger gives you no other choice. The barrel has its own habits. Fill it no more than 2/3. For the first grinding stage, use roughly 1 pound of coarse silicon carbide for every 12 pounds of glass and stone, with enough water to reach just below the upper layer. Let it turn slowly for 7 days. Then wash everything clean before changing grit. Never carry coarse grit into the polishing stage. For silver wire, anneal sterling only to a dull red, about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Then let it cool before drawing. Tighten wraps slowly. Glass remembers pressure. The money is not payment for finding this place, it is time. Use it to make decisions without panic. Use the tools before you replace them. Keep what still works. Learn the sound of the barrel before you trust the clock. Inheritance is not receiving an object. It is deciding whether the work that shaped the object deserves another pair of hands. If you do not want the trade, that is all right. Leave the tools dry. Keep the metals safe. Give the money to someone who needs time, more than possessions. But if your hands feel familiar here, stay a while. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Eleanor Bell. Foster, October 12, 1988. Nora reached the signature and did not move. She read the letter a second time, more slowly. When she finished, she folded each sheet along the original creases, matching corner to corner, and tied the blue thread loosely around it again. Only then did she notice a sentence written in smaller ink along the bottom margin of the final page. Behind the back door, beneath the third stone from the rain barrel, Daniel marked the place where he used to leave his boots. Nora put on her coat. Outside, the wind had shifted inland. She counted the stones along the cabin wall and knelt beside the third. Frost held it firmly. She worked the claw of her hammer beneath one edge and lifted. Under the stone was a narrow brass marker, green around the corners, DF 1944, nothing else. No box, no second cash, just the initials and the year. Nora brushed away the frozen soil with her glove, set the stone beside the marker rather than over it, and stayed crouched until her knees began to ache. Back inside, she opened Ruth's leather roll. The small alcohol lamp was still there. Its wick had dried almost white, but the brass reservoir held. Nora cleaned the cap, added fuel from a bottle on the shelf, and struck a match. The flame rose blue at the base and yellow above it. She remembered Ruth lowering silver wire into that same flame, not because memory arrived as a speech, but because her own fingers moved into the position Ruth's had once occupied. Later that afternoon, Nora walked into town. At Sylvia's cafe, Doris, the waitress who had once left chowder off Nora's bill, set a paper sack beside the register without comment. At Grant's Hardware, Amos added 2 chimney screws to Nora's account and crossed out the price. Margaret Haynes saw Nora passing the county building and came outside long enough to hand her a plastic deed sleeve against the snow. Even the man with orange suspenders from the roadside had left another armful of split birch against Nora's stone wall. None of them knew about the barrel. None knew about the money. They had helped before there was anything to gain. There are kindnesses so small that the giver may forget them before supper. A bowl of chowder, 2 screws, dry firewood left without a name. Think for a moment about one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. You may remember it more clearly than they do. That night, Nora placed Ruth's tool roll beside her blanket and the folded letter beneath the photograph. The Purple Heart remained inside the tin box. Before sleeping, she looked once toward the small brass lamp on the workbench, now cold again, and placed her hand over the leather roll as though keeping it from disappearing. The first real snow came on December 3rd, 6 inches by noon, light enough for Nora to sweep from the porch with a cedar branch. She spent that afternoon beside the stove reading the roofing chapter of Amos Grant's repair book 3 times. The cabin roof measured roughly 26 by 18 feet along the slopes. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated that she needed nearly 500 cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 7 pounds of galvanized nails. Amos looked over her figures at the hardware counter, close enough to learn from. Then he disappeared into the stockroom and returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a narrow blade and a square hammer face. My brother's. He won't need it. Nora understood from his voice not to ask. 2 days later, Silas Ward appeared at the cabin. He was 71, narrow as a fence rail, and had spent 40 years roofing houses between Ellsworth and Mount Desert Island. He examined the sagging north slope, spat into the snow, and refused the $20 Nora offered. keep it for shingles. They worked for 11 days. The damaged rafter was too soft to trust, so Silas showed her how to sister a sound length of spruce beside it, clamping both boards before driving structural screws through in a staggered pattern. They rolled felt from the eaves upward, overlapping each course. Silas snapped a blue chalk line across the first row of cedar, so Nora would stop trusting her eyes. He taught her his three-stroke method for roofing nails: set, drive, finish. On the fourth morning, he touched one nail with the head of his hatchet. That nail's proud. Nora looked at it. Pull it. She did. By mid-December, the last ridge shingle was seated. From the ground, the roof was not perfect. One course near the chimney wandered half an inch before correcting itself. Silas studied it with his hands in his pockets. It'll shed water. For Nora, that was praise enough. January exposed what December had hidden. When Nora brushed snow from the chimney, 2 bricks shed their outer faces beneath her gloves. Others had begun to spall, their surfaces scaling away after years of trapped moisture and freezing. Mortar near the crown could be rubbed into powder between finger and thumb. She removed only what was loose. Amos found hydraulic lime in the back of his storeroom and told her to mix the repair mortar 3 parts sharp sand to 1 part lime. Around the flue, where heat mattered, she worked fire clay into the mortar, at roughly 1 part fire clay to 3 parts prepared mix. For 3 weeks, the temperature rarely climbed above the 20s. She built a canvas windbreak on the roof and carried mortar upward in small buckets so it would not freeze before she placed it. Heavy gloves made the joints clumsy, so she often worked barehanded for several minutes at a time. Every 15 minutes, her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until they hurt again, then returned. She replaced 6 damaged bricks, repointed the upper courses, rebuilt the crown with a slight slope away from the flue, and covered fresh work with burlap at night. Late in January, after several days of curing, she made the test fire small. Paper first, then cedar, then 1 dry split of birch. Nora stepped outside and looked up. A clean gray ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney, pulled straight before the wind took it toward the bay. Nothing leaked into the room. She stood beneath the eaves until the smoke disappeared. The floorboards were white pine, broad and uneven, held down with hand-cut rose-head nails that had darkened almost black. Nora drove every loose nail below the surface with a nail set before bringing in the random orbit sander Amos rented to her for $14 a day. Dust filled the cabin, despite the sheets she hung across the workroom door. The first pass, 80 grit, removed grime, and the remains of old finish. At 120, the board stopped feeling splintered under her palm. The final pass at 220 left the grain clear without making the wood unnaturally smooth. She vacuumed twice and wiped each board by hand. Then came oil. 3 thin coats, each rubbed along the grain, with the final coat given 48 hours to cure before she put furniture back. The floor changed slowly from a dull, dark honey towards something closer to mahogany, though the wood itself had not changed at all. Old stains remained beside the stove. A deep crescent scar near the workroom door survived every pass. Nora left both. One morning she carried the sander to the porch and could not make herself plug it in. A great blue heron stood beyond the marsh grass below the cabin, motionless in shallow water. Nora sat on the porch step. For almost an hour the bird did nothing she could see. Then it lifted 1 foot, placed it farther forward, and waited again. Nora watched until it flew. She did no work that day. The following morning she finished the last section before breakfast. There were 8 windows in the cabin. 3 had no glass at all. 4 had cracked panes held together by old putty and habit. The 8th, on the east wall, contained 1 original pane dated in a carpenter's notation to 1788, thin and imperfect, its surface wavering enough to bend the horizon when Nora looked through it. She would not replace that one. For the others, Amos cut glass to her measurements and showed her how to warm DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms before rolling it into narrow ropes. Nora bedded each pane into a thin layer, pressed glazing points into the sash with the side of her putty knife, then laid the outer bead at an angle that would throw rain away from the wood. The first corner looked terrible. She scraped it clean and began again. The sash cords were worse. Old cotton line had rotted inside the weight pockets. Nora replaced it with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying the end to the cast iron counterweight with a figure-8 knot. The weights disappeared inside the walls with a satisfying downward pull. By the 6th window, she could judge cord length without measuring twice. By the 7th, the lower sash rose under one hand and stayed exactly where she left it. The 8th was the old east window. Nora removed only the failing putty around the 1788 pane, working with the knife nearly flat so its edge would not touch the fragile glass. She reset 2 glazing points, repaired the sash cord, and pressed fresh putty into the gaps without removing the pane from its bed. Near noon, she was smoothing the final corner when movement outside made her stop. A chickadee had landed on the nearest walnut branch, its feet closed around a twig no thicker than Nora's smallest finger. The bird looked toward the window. Nora remained still, with the putty knife in her hand. After several seconds, it hopped once along the branch, gave a single, dry call, and flew toward the spruces. Nora finished the last stroke. She lowered the sash. For the first time since she had arrived, every window in the cabin could close. The plaster failed first beside the chimney. Nora had exposed the old wall carefully, finding horsehair plaster pressed between hand-split oak lath. But her first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged. The third separated along one edge when the stove warmed the masonry. Amos brought her a paper bag from the back of his storeroom. My father kept this. Inside was clean horsehair, tied in loose bundles. Nora mixed lime plaster again, working the hair through it until the fibers spread evenly. This time she wet the lath first. The scratch coat went on thin and rough, scored with horizontal lines before it hardened. Over that, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it 72 hours. The finished coat was barely 1/8 inch, smooth enough to catch afternoon light without erasing the wall's unevenness. When it dried, the repaired section no longer announced itself. Nora pressed her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Then she cleaned the trowel. Doris from Sylvia's Cafe began leaving paper bags on the porch every Thursday. She was a broad woman with silver-framed glasses, always sliding down her nose, and each bag contained something that would keep: biscuits, beans, half a pie, once a jar of chowder base wrapped in newspaper. Nora tried to pay her. Doris pushed the bills back. In candles when the shop reopens. That was the first time anyone had spoken of the cabin as though it might become a shop again. A week later, a red Schwinn bicycle appeared against the stone wall. The boy beside it could not have been more than 16. His name was Caleb Morris. He had a cowlick that refused every attempt at order and carried a splitting maul across one shoulder. My mother said, "About your grandfather." Nora nearly corrected him, then did not. Caleb spent 2 hours splitting the birch round stacked behind the cabin. When Nora held out $5, he shook his head so quickly the cowlick moved. The third kindness came almost every morning. Reverend Boyd walked the quarry road before breakfast in a brown wool coat polished shiny at the elbows. He never came inside. He simply tipped his hat when Nora was outdoors, and one February morning, when sleet had iced the steps, stopped beside the stone wall. May this house endure. 4 words. Then he continued toward town. Nora postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door beneath the stairs had swollen shut, and when she finally opened it, 7 granite steps descended into a 12 by 15-foot room floored with fieldstone. Moisture silvered the mortar. The air smelled of soil, iron, and apples, long gone. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the surrounding stones. Carved into its face was a small oval, crossed by 3 curling lines, the same shape Ruth had once used when she wrapped wire around a piece of sea glass. Nora brushed dirt from the mark. She did not lift the slab. On the way back up, her boot struck something beneath the 3rd step. An oak box had been wedged deep against the riser. Inside lay a brass key, whose bow had been worked into that same wire-wrapped oval. Beneath it was a tintype. A young woman stood outside the cabin in a high-necked summer dress, holding a pair of polishing tongs. The face stopped Nora, the brow, the narrow chin, even the slight unevenness of the mouth. She turned the plate over. Sarah Bell, daughter of Thomas Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Nora carried the photograph upstairs. The brass key went onto the mantel beside Margaret's letter. She tried it in the front door, the workroom cabinet, the old desk, and the tin box. It fit none of them. There it remained. Snow withdrew from the quarry road in Gray Islands. By March, the creek beyond the walnuts had become loud enough to hear from the porch. In April, green catkins hung from the branches that had looked dead all winter. Nora did not restart the full trade. Not yet. She chose 1 ordinary green shard from the workroom stores and decided she would spend 1 coin from the cash on fresh grit. No more. She would practice with small samples until she could identify each stage by touch and sound, rather than by memory alone. Some mornings she failed, edges chipped, wire kinked. A batch came out dull after she carried coarse grit into the next stage without noticing. She washed the barrel twice and began again. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Nora finished the first piece she was willing to call complete. It began as a thick cobalt fragment, no larger than a thumb joint. She tumbled it through successive stages, cleaning the barrel so thoroughly between grits that the rinse water ran clear before she continued. When the glass had lost every cutting edge without losing its old surface, she dried it overnight. The next morning she annealed sterling wire, drew it straight, and shaped a narrow frame around the glass. No glue, no hidden clasp, only tension, proportion, and 4 deliberate wraps. She placed it on the workbench where Ruth's red marble had once caught the stove light. Then she left it there until morning. If the wire loosened during the night, she would begin again. It held. By then the cabin had changed without becoming new. The white pine floors bore their old scars beneath oil. 8 windows closed properly. Lime plaster followed the irregular walls instead of flattening them. The stove drew clean. Shelves held labeled grit jars, wire spools, and sorted glass. Ruth's tools occupied the pegs above the bench. The great tumbler still turned more slowly than a modern machine. Nora preferred it that way. The brass key remained unexplained until the first hard freeze of that winter. A storm tore 1 dead limb from the western walnut. Nora went outside with a pruning saw and found a dull glint beneath loosened bark near the trunk. At shoulder height, almost swallowed by 80 years of growth, was a narrow brass plate. The carved mark at its center matched the key. Nora cleared bark from the edges with the back of her knife. A keyhole appeared. The old brass key entered without resistance. She turned it once, a shallow iron box released from the trunk. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a folded 48-star American flag. Beneath it lay a note written in brown ink. November 11th, 1918, Sarah Bell had written it. The war in Europe ended today. The note began. She wrote that the town bells had rung before breakfast. Men stood in the street without knowing what to do with their hands. Mothers came out of houses carrying photographs. Sarah had folded the flag because Thomas Bell, already old, believed every generation should keep one object that reminded it the world could change while ordinary work continued. She wrote only one sentence about the cabin. We polished glass this afternoon because tomorrow would still need making. Nora read the line twice. Then she refolded the note along its weakened creases and returned the flag to the waxed cloth. She did not hang it. Some things were not decorations. The following August 7th, Nora carried Daniel Foster's Purple Heart to Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor. Margaret's letter had contained no grave location for Daniel because his body had remained overseas, but his name was recorded on a family marker there. Nora cleaned the stone with water and a soft brush, placed the metal beneath the carved surname, and sat on the grass until the morning warmed. Before leaving, she put the metal back into its case. It belonged with the family record. Not exposed to weather. Not sold. Of the $37,000, almost all remained untouched. Nora used one silver $50 when she bought the fresh grit for her first practice batches. Later, she spent 2 more old coins only after Amos explained that their collector value was modest and their history ordinary. She kept a 4th aside to pay for new sterling wire when the inherited spool finally ran out. That was enough. The bills remained in their envelopes. The valuable coins returned to the tin box. Nora wrapped everything in fresh waxed cloth and placed the cash inside the cedar compartment in the barrel. Before replacing the disc, she added a small paper label. For the next one, she dated it. The shop reopened without an announcement. One March morning, Nora pinned an index card to the corkboard at Sylvia's Cafe. Bell Shore Glass. Works repairs. Polishing. Simple wire work. Ask Doris for the list. Nothing more. By summer, more than 40 names had accumulated in a school notebook behind the cafe register. Some wanted old pendants repaired. Others brought jars of beach glass collected by parents or grandparents. Nora accepted only what she could finish carefully. There were weeks when she made 3 pieces. There were weeks when she made none. Nobody complained. Caleb returned one Saturday carrying something awkward beneath a canvas drop cloth. He was taller now. The Schwinn had been replaced by a truck that coughed twice before settling into silence. "What did you break?" Nora asked. "Nothing." He uncovered a hand-carved cedar sign. The letters followed the weathered style of the old board above the cabin door. Bell Shore Glass Works. And below that, smaller, and daughter. Nora looked at him. "I'm not anyone's daughter here." Caleb shrugged. Everybody is somebody's. He had carved the ampersand slightly too deep. One edge of the final S leaned. Nora ran her thumb across the letters. "Where did you learn this?" "Made mistakes. That wasn't the question. It's the answer Amos gives." She laughed once. They hung the sign beneath the older one. Neither came down. That autumn, Nora began another letter. She chose heavy paper and Ruth's fountain pen, which Margaret had sealed with the tools. The first attempt was too formal. She tore it in half. The second explained too much. On the third evening, she wrote only what mattered. "My dear one, whoever you are." She described the barrel and the order of the grits. She explained which window still held its 18th century glass and why it should never be replaced, merely because newer glass would be flatter. She recorded Amos's account book, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's sign, and Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayer. She did not explain Dean. She did not write about the apartment. Some inheritances did not need preservation. She wrote instead that whoever opened the letter should take enough money to gain time, not enough to escape work. She warned them to listen to the tumbler before trusting any printed schedule. Then she placed Sarah's tintype between two sheets of archival paper and added a photograph of herself standing in almost the same place. The resemblance was still there, but no longer complete. Before folding the letter, Nora added one sentence beneath the instructions. The ocean takes our broken things and returns them polished and smooth. She left the new letter unsealed. There might still be things worth adding. Years later, on cold mornings, the creek would continue speaking beneath the walnuts. The tumbler would turn in the back room with its slow wooden rhythm. Sometimes a customer would arrive carrying a jar inherited from someone whose name Nora never knew. She would pour the pieces onto the cedar tray. She would choose one. She would begin. The sea glass polisher's cabin waits. It has always waited. And in the Hancock County Clerk's office, Margaret Haynes eventually retired. Her replacement emptied the desk carefully, finding rubber bands, 2 dried pens, an obsolete tax map, and a $10 bill lying flat beneath the shallow center drawer. There was no receipt attached to it, so the new clerk left it where it was.